Now, although we had 40k's Most Insane Weapons start as a new series, I also want to continue with individual episodes of the Loregear series. And it's been a while since we looked at one piece of 40k Wargear. Now, I never really thought about it before, but Wargear is such a piece of 40k terminology in itself. And one thing I have been thinking a lot about lately is just what makes 40k 40k, and it seems that bashing two words together to make an overtly simplistic but descriptive word like Wargear is certainly a part of it. Now, following on from us looking at the Titanic War on Riser, one thing I noted was people commenting on the quite obviously bonkers main gun of the Nemesis Titan, the Titan-killing QUAKE cannon. The QUAKE cannon is well known by the enemies of humanity as being the weapon to end battles. It is the scourge of enemy fortresses across the galaxy, and although it's most famously seen on Nemesis Titans, it can also be mounted on an Imperial Guard Banesword tank, thus gifting the Militarum one of their most effective ways of breaching an enemy stronghold. Although it exists for this purpose to operate as primarily a siege gun of earth-shattering power and capable of turning nearly any fortification into crumbling ruins and to enable infantry to breach heavy strongholds, it functions equally well against enemy units. In fact, it is very likely that there will be little, if anything, left of even Titanic-scale targets who find themselves on the receiving end of a QUAKE cannon. The power of the QUAKE cannon combined with the armour of a Super Heavy has established the Banesword tank as the pinnacle of Imperial siegecraft. Many Imperial commanders would be willing to exchange two entire regiments for a single Banesword, such is the reputation of this tank. Indeed, Imperial combat doctrines hold an honoured place for the Banesword. While the cannon itself is impressive, it is in fact the ammunition of the QUAKE cannon which is its most noteworthy and the true origin of its fabled reputation. This is because each QUAKE shell fired contains fragments of a planet which has undergone the Imperium's most destructive order, that being Exterminatus. QUAKE cannon and even QUAKE shells can often be named after the planet from which their potency has been captured. It is even described among the Mechanicus and Titanicus operators that their observation how QUAKE shells can appear to scream the presumed death throes of a world's destruction as they cut through the air. These observations have even led to speculation among the more imaginative members of the Imperium that this noise is something beyond just the roar of the physical ammunition cutting through the air and is in fact a darker, more tragic origin, that somehow the Mechanicus have collected the combined death wails of a planet's population. The final screams of billions of humans tearing across the sky before delivering ultimate devastation upon the enemies of mankind. Tech priests have not sought to quash these macabre rumours. But just how this occurs is not something widely noted within the events of Exterminatus. Usually when we talk about Exterminatus, we just talk about the physical process by which a planet is destroyed. However, when a planet undergoes this process, dependent obviously on the specific details on a planet's situation and how safe it is to even approach it, tech priests and Magos geologists from the Adeptus Mechanicus can be dispatched to collect and store quantities of the shattered planet as it breaks and crumbles under the dooming forces being deployed. The Mechanicus will attempt to collect their samples as quickly as possible and in as large quantities as possible. For this is not necessarily a highly regular event, and so where it is necessary and possible, these collections will attempt to secure a very decent stockpile of material for further use. But also, whenever this collection occurs, it is unavoidably an extremely dangerous task. The collecting process is not the only study the Mechanicus carry out, as the geologists will also have stationed their ships in a low orbit, and the purpose of endangering these Mechanicus ships as they're racked by powerful forces emanating from the planet's destruction is the collection of information. Specifically, these blast waves are captured by arcane wave recorders, which are then able to be replicated back on Forge Worlds, although the collective fragments and wave energy are to be reborn in the form of one of the most devastating munitions in the galaxy, the QUAKE shell. This process, although being very dangerous, is extremely important, because it's documented by the Mechanicus that the weight of QUAKE shells is noted as being dependent upon the power of the Exterminatus from which the energy was extracted. the mass of a Quake cannon shell is not as much as that fired by, for example, a Storm Sword's Hellhammer, but Quake shells are still massive and have to be fired over significantly large distances because of its deployment in the role of siege breaking and Titan killing. If you had to get up close and personal and able to actually fire this, it would somewhat defeat the purpose. The extreme range of the cannon and its titanic impact makes it highly coveted by Imperial commanders. The actual sound and visual blast upon impact of a Quake shell is not easily described, because when a Quake shell makes its impact, it will do so with a near unimaginable blast, the concentrated agony and seismic tearing forces of a dying world distilled down into a planet-shattering blast. Essentially, it's delivering a concentrated piece of Exterminatus. Beyond just cracking through heavy fortress walls or turning a warlord titan into craters of liquid metal and slag, it's not uncommon for the Quake shell to cause also instant geological fissures, huge cracking fault lines that can begin to appear across the outer walled perimeter of a citadel. Buildings may disappear into the depths of a planet, and any survivors of the blast will be swallowed by the cracked surface of a world. Unleashing a munition as powerful as the Quake shell can quite easily lead to unforeseen consequences like earthquakes or spewing magma from below ground. In the worst possible situations, it could potentially even lead to seismic chain reactions that could in fact destroy entire cities or even worse. Most often though, it will simply enable a breach in enemy fortifications that will leave them reeling and so confused that by the time they're assessing damage and attempting to fortify, the next blow will already be upon them as Imperial forces and thousands of guardsmen rush to breach the defences. But there are still alternate roles. It's not the preference, but if there were no suitable ordnance available, a very skillful Imperial commander may be able to maneuver a vehicle to direct a Quake cannon towards large enemies or even large hordes of enemy. This though is generally difficult, as the cannon is nearly always hull mounted and configured for long range engagement. Even when mounted upon an Imperial Guard tank, the lack of speed means it's hardly suited to hunting down war engines. It is best deployed against near enough stationary targets. However, if an enemy position is able to be scouted without their knowing, then a Quake cannon could absolutely devastate enemy infantry and hardware before a battle has even begun and potentially save significant resources. This would carefully be weighed up by an Imperial commander, because Quake shells are certainly not what you would describe as a plentiful munition. If an enemy can be destroyed through sheer weight of Imperial Guard manpower and the lives of Astra Militarum guardsmen, then so be it. If there is an opportunity to save hundreds of pieces of Imperial hardware, knights, perhaps even titans, then opting to deploy Quake cannon shells may well be preferable. Within the Banesword tank-mounted Quake cannon, arcane targeting augers are maintained by the tech priests and their servitors, who will monitor the blows of the Quake cannon. Very likely whispering prayers over the shoulders of the drivers and gunners, it is their skill which helps to ensure that even when fired over absolutely massive distances, the accuracy of the weapon is maintained to a high degree, for it truly has to be. A Quake cannon is not a weapon to miss your target with. A stray blast could have dire consequences, not to mention of course also just wasting the round. It is noteworthy that during the Cadian 87th's assault against traitor guardsmen on Chandrax II, a Quake shell narrowly missed the top of a fortress wall and landed in the distance. The sudden vibrations of where it actually came to fall disturbed a dormant Necron monolith, and the ensuing implacable wave of awoken warriors ended up actually destroying the Cadian regiment. A fairly specific set of circumstances to be sure, but it's noteworthy that the power of a Quake shell is in fact so great that it can, quite literally, wake the dead. So the recoil of the Quake cannon is understandably enormous, and whilst a Nemesis Titan, essentially a warlord, can handle this shockwave when fired relatively well, the Imperial Guard have more of a challenge in mounting such a heavy weapon as the Quake cannon on a tank chassis, and this means that Banesword tanks are required to be one of the most robust vehicles within the Astra Militarum and indeed the Imperium. Banesword tanks are of course based on the STC of the Bane Blade, and consequently only a small percentage of Forge Worlds are able to manufacture both the vehicle and weapon. Where a Warlord Titan may be equipped with a single Mars Alpha pattern Nemesis Quake cannon, there remains of course one Titan larger, the Imperator Titan. which is, as you may expect, capable of having multiple Quake cannons mounted on its carapace hardpoint. But even Warlords are not exclusively restricted to using the Quake cannon only on the Nemesis. There is also another arm-mounted variation for Warlord Titans known as the Mori Quake cannon. And the Mori Quake cannon is in fact one of the most devastating weapons a Warlord Titan can bear. The immense Quake shells it fires when used against a battlefield target are of course easily capable of wreaking utter annihilation. The seismic shockwave that these shells cause can leave any enemy unfortunate enough to survive slowed down to a crawl, making them easy prey for the Titan's other weapons or supporting Imperial Knights to then tear them apart. And I had not noted it to this point, and perhaps to the end, that the effect of something like a Quake shell would have on smaller infantry elements, but that's because it should be very obvious that for any ground infantry caught in the shockwave or the sight of a Quake cannon could very easily suffer an entire list of injuries, from being simply vaporized to having their body near enough liquefied by just the shockwave, broken bones, blindness, or just internal wounds. There's hardly a battlefield injury that isn't likely to be caused by the blast of a Quake cannon. As per usual, these Loregear videos are on the shorter side of things, but I'll just finish off by saying, we often talk about the grim darkness of the 40k verse, and it's something I want to drill down on more separately. But there can be fewer grim, dark weapons than a gun shooting gigantic shells capable of liquefying a Warlord Titan, containing the shattered remnants and the death screams of a dying world having been summarily condemned to Exterminatus by the bleak dystopian bureaucracy of the Imperium of Mankind.